Welcome, everyone. We appreciate your being with us today. My name is Angie Pete Yowell, and on behalf of the University of Texas College of Liberal Arts Development Office and Public Affairs teams, I'd like to welcome you to On Course with Liberal Arts. Our faculty and students make an impact through their study of the issues that our society faces, and we're proud to showcase the college's outstanding research and teaching. Today's topic is of special interest during this period where our nation, and indeed the world, are focused on acknowledging and addressing racial disparities and injustice. If you have questions for Dr. Coakley, please send them via the chat function and we'll answer as many as we can in the last half of the webinar. It is my honor to introduce you to our speaker, Dr. Kevin Cokley. Dr. Coakley is a professor of African and African Diaspora Studies in the Educational Psychology Department, as well as a faculty affiliate of the Center for African and African American Studies at the University of Texas. He holds and is also the director of the College of Liberal Arts Institute for Urban Policy Research and Analysis. Dr. Coakley holds the Oscar and Ann Mousy Regents Professorship for Educational Research and Development in the College of Education and is a fellow of the UT System Academy of Distinguished Teachers and a member of the UT Academy of Distinguished Teachers. He is author of the 2014 book, The Myth of Black Anti-Intellectualism, and has written several op-eds in major media outlets on topics such as Blacks' rational mistrust of police, the aftermath of Ferguson, police and race relations, racism, and white supremacy, the use of school vouchers and racial disparities in school discipline. Dr. Coakley's research has been recognized in media outlets including the New York Times, USA Today, and Inside Higher Education. In fact, he had something published in USA Today yesterday. Now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Coakley.
All right. Thank you very much. And it is really my honor and privilege to be speaking about the wonderful work that is being conducted by the Institute for Urban Policy Research and Analysis, otherwise known as IOprah. And so what I've done is attempt to really summarize in a relatively brief amount of time some of the outstanding work that has been conducted by the staff of IOprah. And so we have titled this e-talk, Using Policy Research and Public Scholarship to Eliminate Racial Bias and Disparities. And we know the importance of public policy to address and eliminate racial bias and disparities has really been underscored with the COVID-19 pandemic, and along with the renewed attention that has been placed on racism and police brutality. And so in this talk, what I hope to do is to discuss the recent work of IOprah in the areas of education, housing, and criminal justice. The Institute's work has been used to shape discourse, to provide recommendations, and to offer thought leadership on issues that impact virtually every aspect of African American and our lived experiences. And so I want to start off by just addressing or just sort of defining what we are referring to. There are many societal problems and challenges facing Black communities that need to be solved. And public policy problems are those that must be addressed by laws and regulations that have been adopted by the government. Now, for example, Governor Abbott recently mandated that Texans in most counties wear masks in public. Now, why did he make this mandate? He made the mandate after prior statements simply encouraging people to wear masks failed to slow down the spread of COVID-19. And so what we know about public policy is that public policy solutions are important because they legislate behaviors that otherwise cannot be enforced. And when you're talking about issues related to racism and bias and discrimination, oftentimes people talk about there needing to be a change of heart. And certainly, ultimately, I think we would all like to see that, right? We would like to be in a world where we all love each other and that you can simply use persuasion and appealing to people's better angels, as it were, to get them to do the right things. Well, unfortunately, we know that that does not always work, and that in this world, in this country, we really need the power of public policy, so that when people don't simply do the right thing, that they can then sort of have to um, be accountable by the legislation that says you have to do these things. And so we really believe in the importance of public policy and its ability to really sort of cause people, or to, require people to act in ways that otherwise we would not be able to enforce. And so that's why we are interested in public policy research. So IOprah this year, we made a decision to really focus on one area. I've sort of, kidded around with my staff that, they really wore me down, because I have been of the mindset that we really need to be true to all of the areas of research that we focus on. And again, those areas would include education, health, wealth and poverty, housing, and criminal justice. And that's a lot to cover. And my staff, you would always remind me, or has always reminded me, that, we're trying to do too much within the course of any given year. And so I finally sort of took heed to what they suggested, and we decided that for this past year, we would just focus on one of those areas primarily. And that did not mean that we would not address other issues as they emerged, and as we sort of, found out that did happen. But we chose as our focal point the issue of education. Education is one area that I'm particularly passionate about. I have done a lot of my own research around educational issues pertaining to African American students. And so I felt very comfortable that this would be an area that we could sort of jump into and be very successful. Also, we had already done a lot of work in that area, and it just seems to be an area that informs all of the other issues that we are interested in. And as it turned out, and this was really rather serendipitous, the issue that dominated Austin, certainly before COVID-19, before the issues of police brutality, was the issue of school closures. And as you may be aware, the AISD system proposed a school change strategy that would close 12 schools in response to declining enrollment rates and budget concerns. And as it turned out, the majority of these closures were concentrated in East Austin. And what do we know about East Austin? Well, East Austin, of course, that's where we see a disproportionate number of Black and brown folks. And so this proposed school closure would then disproportionately displace Black students who would be transferred to similarly under-resourced schools. And as we know, the community was not happy about this, and there was a lot of emotion, a lot of strong feelings that was being communicated, in town hall meetings, and really community activists making known their concerns. And so we decided that this was an issue that we needed to take on. It clearly, fit within our focus on education. And so IOprah wrote a policy brief, which recommended that AISD extend the voting deadline and to reference research on school closures to help inform the vote. One of the things that we thought was pretty interesting, and I'm saying interesting, somewhat, somewhat loosely, is the fact that there was a lot of discussion about school closures, and yet if you refer to educational research, you would have seen that school closures is not the end all be all. In other words, there was research that had been conducted that talked about some of the limitations, and if not problems, associated with school closures. A large body of research highlights that school closures and consolidations do not typically work as a cost-saving strategy. And not only do they not work as a cost-saving strategy typically, it also disproportionately affects low-income and minority students. And again, this was something that we believe the community, felt really intrinsically and needed some support in terms of research to refer to so that they could, better articulate their concerns. IOprah also wrote an issue brief which reviewed research regarding school closures and identified some of the adverse effects that school closures would have on academic achievement, on trauma, and the disruption for students and families. I mean, one of the things that we found out, and we've always known this, is that schools are embedded within the communities. You have families who've had generations of students attending these schools. The schools were very, very important to these communities, and to simply sort of suggest that we're going to close these 12 schools that have so much history and so much meaning to the residents of these communities, it really, in our opinion, was not the solution. Was a bit short-sighted, and it really did not address, what we understand through research to be some of the sort of very consequential adverse effects, again, on achievement, on mental health, on the trauma, and the disruption that it causes students and families. IOprah also wrote a policy brief focusing on lessons to be learned from the Dallas Independent School District's Accelerating Campus Excellence Program, otherwise known as ACE. And in this brief, we identified the importance of sort of like recruiting children for pre-K, the importance of recruiting and retaining highly effective principals, because we know that principals are critically important for schools. Having effective principals can positively impact achievement, can positively impact teacher effectiveness, and most certainly positively impacts the school culture. And in this policy brief, we talked about placing the best teachers at the lowest performing schools and providing them with bonuses. Too often you'll see that there is this inequity where you have the best teachers at the most well-resourced schools. It's sort of like, the rich getting richer. And so we propose that why not take it, the best teachers that we have and to place them in the lowest performing, the most under-resourced schools, and to reward them for teaching in those schools by providing them bonuses. And then in response to community conversations where parents and community members express concern that neighborhood schools would be sold to developers, because I think, understandably so, there was this pervasive mistrust on the part of the community. Why is it that they are targeting our schools? What is it that they are really wanting to do with our schools? And so this concern sort of existed that the schools would, sort of be sold to developers, and wondering if that was really the part of the motivation for closing these schools. IOprah, in response to that, wrote a numbers brief that provided information about the rising property values of AISD schools slated for closure. And this was very important information for the community to have. And then, of course, we had COVID-19 happen. And COVID-19 has really shaken up education and has introduced a series of new concerns that education must address. IOprah wrote an issue brief that explored the digital divide in Texas and identified Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio as leading in households without having a fixed internet. And the brief identified technological barriers that have resulted in what has been called the homework gap, which exacerbates inequities. And so in this brief, it was suggested that policymakers consider centralizing school communication and recognizing that major internet carriers have limits to internet use. There were also several city-specific briefs that were written regarding the impact of COVID-19. So for example, one of our briefs that focused on Austin found that the number one barrier associated with the digital divide is that the internet is simply too expensive. In Dallas, Black households were found to lack internet access at greater rates than all other racial and ethnic groups. Houston was found to rank as the third major US city with the worst internet connection rate, and Blacks are more likely to reside in digitally weak neighborhoods. And in San Antonio, we found that about 25% of San Antonio households have no access to internet at all. And then finally, in the area of education, we did work related to the implementation of African American studies in the high school curriculum. I am especially proud of this work as I was involved in helping come up with the curriculum that would be later adopted for this for Texas high schools. And so IOprah wrote an op-ed addressing the need to be careful to not sanitize African American studies and to teach it accurately. This op-ed was written in response to concerns that the teaching of slavery might somehow be taught in a way that did not accurately and honestly convey the true horrors of slavery. And so an op-ed was written to address this. And IOprah also provided public testimony before the State Board for Education in support of adding a new high school African American Studies course. And of course, we are very happy to have participated in that public testimony. The second area that we focused on was housing, particularly in the area of affordable housing. IOprah wrote a series of issue briefs examining affordable housing in Austin, given its impact on other areas of life. In this brief, or in these series of briefs, several measures have been introduced and were identified that address the shortage of affordable units, including increasing more affordable housing developments across the city. The brief also identified several factors that contributed to increased housing unaffordability, including population growth, rising property values, increasing property taxes, and stagnant wages. Recommendations that were made in the brief included making the Austin Land Code more accessible to the community, reevaluating neighborhood plans that prevent the development of affordable housing, and addressing misconceptions of what affordable housing is and who benefits from accessing these housing options. We also produced a brief that focused on homeowner associations. IOprah wrote an issue and policy brief addressing how homeowner association practices may in fact exacerbate racial segregation. So for example, in these HOAs, these homeowner associations, it allows residents to selectively isolate themselves. And there are a few homeowner associations that have large Black populations. And we see that the higher the average income has led to a sort of quickened homeowner association formation. And so in the brief, we argue that policy reform is needed to increase the protection of homeowners across the state because there is no regulatory body overseeing homeowner associations in Texas. And then because of events that have occurred over the last few months, we turned our attention to criminal justice. IOprah wrote a brief, or actually an op-ed that addressed the death penalty. And this was in response to the planned execution of Rodney Reed. And it was important that we produced this op-ed because of all of the attention that had been generated nationally regarding the planned execution of Rodney Reed. And we specifically focus on the racial disparity in public opinion about the death penalty. This particular op-ed was interesting in that it took the angle that it's problematic to have a jury that is that consists of all white jurors when we know from social science research that white folks are more likely to endorse the death penalty than black folks and other folks of color. And so when you have someone, who is black, who is essentially being tried and with the possible outcome being death, that it really is disadvantageous to have a jury that does not consist of individuals who are representative of that particular defendant's racial and ethnic background. And then, of course, there's the issue of police brutality. We wrote an op-ed that addressed the impact of police brutality on Black people. We have recently produced a history of policing brief, which is incredibly timely and very educational in sort of highlighting all the issues that we know have been associated with the history of policing. We have recently been asked by Senator Horace West to review the use of force and use of deadly force policies in Texas police departments across the entire state of Texas. And in some of my own work, I have conducted de-escalation training for several police departments in California, as well as de-escalation training for the Travis County Sheriff's Department. And I have another scheduled training in the fall. And as you might imagine, there is a sense of urgency that this happen, given everything that is happening around us. And this is just a sampling of some of the outstanding work that has been conducted by the staff of IOprah. IOprah's work has played a critical role in helping AIC representatives, such as Chief Equity Officer Dr. Stephanie Hawley, consider the racial inequities of proposed school closures. And really, in large part, I think it's fair to say, in large part, due to the research that we've conducted and due to our sort of engagement with the community, our efforts helped to reduce the number of closed schools from 12 to 4. Now, I think for some, they would argue that 4 is still too many, but I think it's fair to say that a reduction of 12 to 4 schools is quite an achievement, and IOprah's research and efforts really contributed to that reduction. We have also engaged in organized community conversation with East Austin's key voices to better understand issues in the Black community. We've been asked to participate in community town hall meetings to address racial equity issues in AISD. We have created a Black Lives Texas podcast to examine how social issues and policies affect Black Texans. And in this first season, the podcast addressed the impact of COVID-19 on Black people in Austin, and specifically in the areas of education. I am especially proud of the work that we have done in the area of public scholarship. And by public scholarship, we mean the scholarly activity that is intended to serve the public interest. And these sort of examples of public scholarship can include op-eds, can include interviews, and can include the delivering of talks. We have published numerous op-eds in high-profile national outlets. Some of these outlets include USA Today, U.S. News and World Report, CNN, and The Hill, among others. And we've also published numerous op-eds in various state newspapers, including the Austin American-Statesman, the Dallas Morning News, the Houston Chronicle, among others. And in several instances, these op-eds have led to requests for interviews. And so we have been interviewed for several media outlets, or by several media outlets, including CNN, Fox 7 Morning News, Fox 7 Morning Show, KVUE News, KAZI, the Austin Spectrum News, the San Antonio Spectrum News, the Community Impact newspaper, and the local Boston network, among others. We have participated in the National Newswise Live Expert Panel on protests against police killings. We have been interviewed on the Texas Public Radio in regards to race and policing. Recently, we conducted a webinar on how race and implicit bias impact the law for the Texas American Board of Trial Advocates, otherwise known as ABOTA. This is an invitation-only group of trial lawyers and judges. And so, in summary, these are just some of the examples of how IOprah uses policy research and public scholarship to eliminate racial biases and disparities. It is an incredibly important time in our country's history, and IOprah is perfectly positioned to address some of the pressing issues that are facing our city, our state, and our country. And I'm incredibly proud to be at the helm of this very important institute, the Institute for Urban Policy Research and Analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Coakley. Well, let's get to some questions. First, we have, to address racial and social bias and disparities within higher education, does the University of Texas plan to suspend or eliminate the requirement of GRE exams for graduate degree applications?
Very good question. I have read recently that there has been discussion about the suspension of the requirement of the GRE. I don't want to misspeak without having, an ability to sort of, go back and refer to the email or the series of emails that have been sent. But I can tell you that there's been a lot of discussion around that, and I am aware that there has been a suspension of the use of the ACT and the SAT, which I think many people are very pleased by, and so it, to me, stands to reason that that would be followed by a suspension of the GRE, perhaps. Now, whether that would extend to the GMAT, the LSAT, and other standardized tests, I think that remains to be seen. So, but it would not surprise me if that followed.
Thank you. We have another question. Is anyone beginning, or has anyone already begun, longitudinal studies on the effects of de-escalation training? Are any other trainings provided? And this commenter says, congrats for your extensive outreach.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the congrats. That's a really interesting question. What I can tell you is that, the use of sort of de-escalation training, and I guess, sort of relatedly, implicit bias training, is a mixed bag in terms of its efficacy and effectiveness. You'll see that some research has pointedly stated that there's not a lot of data that there is sustained sort of behavioral changes as a result of either de-escalation training or implicit bias training. Some of the research would suggest that, the changes, if any, take place are rather short-lived. And so certainly this is, not ideal. And I guess what I would submit to you is that while it's not perfect, and while it certainly has a lot of room for improvement, it is certainly better than the alternative, which is to offer nothing. And we need to continue to sort of do research to figure out ways that implicit bias training and de-escalation training can result in longer term sustained behavioral change. Just because we're not there yet does not mean that we should not continue trying to improve these practices, because fundamentally they are, I believe, addressing something very important. And I think that we can continue to improve upon, sort of what we know is effective and what is not effective based on science.
Thanks. Next question. It was mentioned that internet access was limited in some of the larger Texas cities. Is there a proposal on how to close that gap?
Oh, is there a proposal on how to close that gap? We've provided some general recommendations for policymakers to consider. I'm not aware of a specific proposal. Now, I will say, and I want to give my staff much, if not most of the credit here. My staff who actually sort of wrote these briefs and conducted the primary research would be able to sort of tell you in very specific detail whether there are any proposals that are currently out now. What I can tell you is that we've made recommendations to address the sort of the disparities and the sort of the issues that would result in there being racial differences in access. I can find out if there are specific proposals in place, and I would be happy to sort of share that with you.
That would be great. We can post that along with the video afterwards. When researching these areas, how much of a challenge is it to ask the right questions in the right manner? Are there challenges that are unique to this area of scholarship?
And if by this area of scholarship, the individual is referring to just sort of racial disparities, I mean, there are always challenges. I mean, as a researcher, I would tell you that the outcomes that you're sort of looking for are influenced by the quality of the inputs. So in this case, sort of what questions are you asking? What is the methodology that you're using? Are you sort of asking like survey-based questions? That's a quantitative sort of methodology. Are you asking focus group questions? Are you asking interview questions, which would be more sort of qualitative? I suspect that this question was probably getting at the latter, more sort of qualitative. But no, absolutely. The types of questions that you ask, the quality of the questions that you ask will dictate to a certain extent the quality and type of responses that you receive. And this is why it's important that you have individuals who are trained researchers who understand how to go about asking questions, what types of questions should be asked, the phrasing of the questions becomes really important. I think sometimes people take for granted that this is a social science, that there's it's not just simply an art, that there are actually ways that we can do this that we know to be more effective. And it's not simply sort of just going out and asking the first thing that sort of comes to your mind. So I appreciate the question.
Thank you. Can you talk about the importance and uniqueness of having a policy institute closely aligned with an academic department and the impact on students?
Yes, I can talk about that. So with our policy institute, and perhaps I should have mentioned at the very beginning, we are part of or affiliated with Black Studies. So Black Studies at UT Austin consists of the African and African Diaspora Studies Department, the Warfield Center for African American Studies, of course, the Institute for Urban Policy Research and Analysis, and then most recently, the Black Studies Art Galleries. We believe that we are sort of unique with that particular configuration. We are not aware of really any other university in the country that has these sort of 4 units that are all sort of housed under the auspices of Black Studies. And part of what it does is it sort of removes things from the abstract, from sort of this sort of intellectual abstraction, to really sort of practical things, and practical sort of behaviors that we can sort of engage in. So in other words, when students are learning about systemic racism, institutional racism, for example, and taking classes where professors are sort of talking, oftentimes in very theoretical terms about these constructs, having a policy institute allows those sort of concepts and in some instances sort of theoretical abstractions to be translated into sort of real life implications. What does it mean to say that there is institutional racism in the school systems? What does that look like? How does it manifest in different schools? And most importantly, and this is why it's particularly important to have a policy institute, what can we do about it? I said at the very beginning that the world of sort of public policy is incredibly important because it requires, or it allows us to sort of legislate behavior. And with racism, and you've probably heard it said before, you can't simply legislate away hate. And what we can do, though, is we can legislate, making sure that there are no systemic or institutional sort of barriers that would sort of block, anyone's ability to sort of have equal opportunity. So having a policy institute affiliated closely aligned with an academic department really allows this sort of synergy where faculty and students can be in conversation with public policy professionals in a way that is mutually beneficial. We benefit from, and of course I occupy, a foot in both camps, but I think that the Institute benefits from the research and expertise of the scholars affiliated with departments. And of course, we hope that the department, and not just, the African Diaspora Studies department, but we hope that academic departments in general can benefit from our applied expertise in taking those sort of concepts and sort of translating them to sort of real tangible public policy.
Thank you. The next question is along those same lines. Can you share how your team utilizes op-eds to share research and reach audiences who aren't academics?
Yes, I will use myself as an example. My op-eds have, largely centered on, issues pertaining to race and racism. And what I try to do in those op-eds is to expose the public to things to information that we in the academy sort of know, but that might not always be known, to the public. And if I can sort of think of, one example, a few years ago, I remember writing an op-ed, or actually a series of op-eds, highlighting racial disparities in the use of school discipline. And so it's one thing, to sort of hear people talk about there being this sort of how Black children, brown children are disproportionately punished in schools. But I was able to use the op-ed as a way to sort of talk in a more accessible way so that people could understand, why there was such concern and what it was based on. So, providing a research-based sort of argument about why schools are really sort of problematizing the existence of Black and brown children. Of course, in doing that, there's pushback, and I don't know if this is a question that the viewers might sort of ask, but I'll sort of answer it in anticipation of it. But when you write these op-eds, and when you write them particularly on issues that are hot button issues or politically contentious issues, or any issue where people have very strong opinions, you will receive pushback, and you will in some instances anger people. When I wrote the op-ed about racial disparities in the use of school discipline, I had some teachers who emailed me who were upset, and who I think were trying to correct me in sort of talking about their experience, as teachers, and how in their minds there was not any sort of disparate treatment of Black or brown kids, that the disparities that you saw in punishment was based on Black and brown kids being disproportionately more likely to misbehave. And so that's where the idea then of implicit bias becomes very important. So we as scholars, as researchers, we help the public understand this idea of implicit bias and tie it to sort of a real life example of how implicit bias has impacted school settings to the point where kids of color are being disproportionately sort of treated.
Thank you. Has IOprah had success in partnering with local grassroots organizations who need complex data analyzed in order to amplify their work?
Yes, we have, and I can say it has been a journey. I have been the director of IOprah since 2013, where I was initially the interim director and later becoming the permanent director in 2014. And I can tell you that one of the ongoing conversations that we've had, throughout my tenure has been, sort of our relationship with the community. Um, I can recall having conversations with our advisory council where we would sort of spend time sort of telling them about the wonderful work that we had done, similar to sort of what I've done here today, talking about, the many policy briefs and issues briefs and numbers briefs and op-eds that we have produced. We've always been a pretty, sort of prolific institute. But I can recall when some of the advisory council members would say, it's really interesting because we haven't heard any of this, and we're in the community and we don't know what you all are doing. And so it caused us to redouble our efforts and to sort of, focus more on cultivating relationships with the community. And I can tell you that with our current staff now, they have done an exceptional job of cultivating relationships with, like, the Austin Justice Coalition, for example, among others. And how do we know that this is the case? Because we are now being contacted by activists, from the community, asking us for our assistance, inviting us to participate in town hall meetings, because we have sort of put in the work, because my staff has taken the time to go to the community, to go to these town halls, to listen. That's important, because I think part of what sometimes ends up happening with the academy is that we sort of go in with this sort of all-knowing posture, and that's a turnoff to members of the community. No one is more of an expert on their lived experience than the community itself. And so what my staff has done, I think brilliantly, has been to sort of go into the communities, to listen to the concerns of the community, and then to be able to sort of offer to the community, sort of what we as an institute, as a policy institute, can provide to help them sort of then become their own sort of saviors, if you will, where they can sort of take the information that we have sort of produced and use it to sort of act in their best interest. So I am incredibly proud of where we are now, and where we will sort of continue to sort of grow in terms of our presence in the community, our work with different sort of community entities, and I think there's a lot of evidence to support that.
Great, thanks. Recently, you published a research report, or IOprah published it, that concluded that Travis County in particular has the most segregated schools in the state. Can you comment on why Travis County is unique in this way and how we might go about remedying that?
Well, I would love for the author of that report, who was one of our brilliant doctoral interns, I would love for her to to respond to that. She is an Austin parent, doctoral student who has been involved with the AISD for many, many years. So I would not presume to be able to sort of speak in an area that is clearly her area of expertise. I will say this, that when I read the report, I think, like many people, was shocked. Well, let me step back. I won't say so much shocked as a little surprised, because I think, in Austin there is this narrative about sort of being, this very sort of progressive city, this sort of blue dot, in the midst of sort of a very sort of red sea. And so we have sort of, we told ourselves as a city that we don't have these sort of issues. And so I think that the report really underscores that in spite of this narrative that we have about our city, that there is deep-seated segregation. I mean, and in fact, I know this is a bit tangential, but I'll refer you to the series of reports that IOprah sort of produced, led by our faculty fellow, Dr. Eric Tang, where we documented, how African Americans were leaving Austin proper because they simply could not afford. There are a number of different reasons. I mean, gentrification obviously, is the key issue, and there were a number of factors associated with African Americans leaving. So the Austin proper, including rising property taxes. They simply cannot afford to buy a home or to continue to pay property taxes. In Austin, the increasing sort of concerns around disparate treatment at the hands of police. And then of course, economic opportunities becoming increasingly, more difficult to obtain. And so the issue of segregation, I think, is, in some way sort of tied into the larger issue of what's happening with African Americans and why African Americans have had to almost be forced to sort of leave, the city.
Could HOAs be used as a strategy to prevent rampant gentrification and community displacement, like a less complicated land trust? And perhaps it's referring to gentrification that has not yet happened.
My short answer would be yes, but only if there was actually, sort of a formal sort of set of regulations. I mean, you'll recall that what was reported in our brief was that, HOAs are largely, not regulated, or certainly there's no regulatory body that oversees them. And so, if there was a regulatory body that sort of oversees HOAs and could sort of really drive their behavior, then I think that this certainly, could happen.
Thank you. Okay, could you tell us about what you are most proud of for your own teaching and research, as well as IOprah?
Well, I'll start off with IOprah. And it's sort of related to what I've already touched on. I am most proud of the impact and visibility of IOprah's work. The staff that we have is second to none. I tell them this all the time. They make me look good because they are exceptional professionals. The quality of their work is again second to none, and I'm very, very proud of who they are and of their efforts to make IOprah relevant. And so that is pretty easy for me to say for all the reasons that I've already sort of touched upon. In terms of my own scholarship, I'm very proud of my research, especially in the area of the imposter phenomenon. In recent years, I have become very well known for that line of research. The imposter phenomenon, of course, is the idea that individuals who are very competent, who are very sort of intelligent, nevertheless feel like intellectual frauds. And I've taken that research and applied it to the experiences of students of color, especially African American students, who are in predominantly white educational spaces. That research has allowed me to really sort of fill a gap in terms of attitudes and experiences and feelings that students of color often experience that had not really had a lot of attention drawn to it. And in a fairly long career where I've published a fair amount of research, no area of research has garnered more attention for me than this area of the imposter phenomenon. So I'm really proud of that. And I guess relatedly, I am also very proud of the public scholarship that I've started to do over the last 5 to 6 years. When I was a young assistant professor and when I was going up for tenure, I remember sort of saying at the time that I wanted to really have an impact as a scholar, and that in my mind, the way to do that was to become a public intellectual. I had a very rosy view of what it meant to be a public intellectual, and probably at that time I did not fully comprehend, all that it entailed. 20 plus years later, once I started engaging in public scholarship, through the efforts of my sort of being a part of the op-ed project, I think my professional identity began to change, because I realized that I was no longer confined to the writing of articles in academic journals, writing book chapters, which, by and large are typically only read by a small number of academics. So engaging in this public scholarship has increased my voice, my visibility, my influence, in ways that I would have never imagined. And while there are some drawbacks to that, I was sharing with some colleagues and friends that I have received some pretty nasty emails during that time, including one this morning that was particularly nasty. I understand that goes to the territory that once you sort of step into the arena of public scholarship and putting yourself out there, that there will be pushback. But I'm still proud of my presence, my visibility. I hope that I am serving as a model for students and maybe younger scholars, in terms of how they can be both scholars and also sort of engage publicly in ways that they want.
Thank you. That's much appreciated. Could you tell us a little bit about what fields that your students go into?
So I'm a psychologist. I'm a counseling psychologist by training, and and part of my academic appointment is in the Department of Educational Psychology. So if the question is about my students, in terms of the students that I advise and mentor in my capacity as a professor, my students largely go into either academia or practice, private practice, or working in hospitals or other sort of community mental health sort of settings. So it's either that or it is academia.
Great. Okay. I just want to say thank you to everyone who submitted questions. We weren't able to get to them all today, but we appreciate your interest, and certainly we can follow up afterwards. The last question for you, Dr. Coakley, is what are you reading right now? What books?
I am reading Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. I'm a little late because the book has been out, clearly for a while, but I'm reading it because I will be facilitating a discussion with freshmen, incoming freshmen at UT. And so obviously I will need to have read it so that I can facilitate the discussion. And Angie, if I could just sort of say this, just one last thing, because I know that my staff, I think, are still out there listening to me. As I've said before, they are an incredible, group. They are the ones who are grinding, who doing the writing, who are sort of out in the community. And so whatever, specific questions I was not able to answer, is simply because I was not the primary, sort of person responsible for writing those reports. I would encourage everyone who is listening to go to IOprah's website, to go to the links that house all of our briefs, to contact the authors of those briefs, and they will be able to answer in very specific detail some of the questions that you asked that I was not able to answer specifically. They've put in an incredible amount of time and work, and you need to benefit from their expertise.